I found myself obsessed by the shofar this year, by its sound, by that feeling that I have every time I hear it. There's something so primal about the sound of human breath through the horn of an animal that no metal instrument can match. Every time I hear it, and in my house, we hear it a lot. Sometimes Daniel wakes the kids up with the shofar. Not their favorite way to wake up. But every time I hear it, it breaks my concentration and forces its way under my skin and into my consciousness. The sound of the shofar, for good, for bad, or for reasons in between, is always the sound of disruption, of change, of the end of the old and the beginning of the new, whether we like it or not. So whatever we were thinking about before the blast, whatever we were trying to focus on, whatever we were distracted by, the shofar doesn't care. Its sound interrupts and disrupts and forces our minds to adjust to its reality, not the reality that we wished existed. So I want to share a story with you today about a woman who, in her grief and in her awakening to the reality of the world, rather than the world she wished she lived in, gave us the shofar calls, Tikiah, Shevarim, and Truah. Our story comes from the book of Judges, where we find ourselves living in the land of Israel, generations after Moses and Joshua are gone. There's a leadership vacuum. We are being tormented day in and day out by Canaanite warlords, and our very survival as individuals and as a people feels more precarious by the moment. The worst of the Canaanite leaders was a man named Sisera, someone so evil in his actions that the Talmud compares him to Haman. Boo. That was good. You can boo Sisera now too. After suffering under his thumb for 20 long years, Devorah the prophetess rises up and through her brilliance and her bravery executes a strategy that routs Sisera's army, leaving his troops decimated and Sisera himself dead. But then after endless chapters that glory and revel in our victory, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, gives us a poem, a final image of Sisera's mom sitting by the window, dreaming up desperate fantasies about where her son must be and what he must be doing as she refuses to accept the reality of her loss. Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she gazed. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is so late the clatter of his wheels? The wisest of her ladies give answer. She too replies to herself. They must be dividing the spoil they have found. Spoil of dyed cloths for Sisera, spoil of embroidered cloths, a couple of embroidered cloths for everybody as spoil. This image of Sisera's mother peering out the window, waiting for her son's return from battle, is heartbreaking. We've all been there, sitting by a window, staring out into a fantasy, desperate to ward off a reality that is too painful to live in. You can feel it when you read this text. With each question Sisera's mom asks herself about his absence, they must be dividing the spoil. There must be so much loot that they're delayed while our soldiers fill their hands with gold and with jewels. With each proclamation that she makes, with each fantasy that she is forcing into her mind, you can feel her desperation. You can feel that she knows he's gone, that her son has been killed. And then all of a sudden, her house of cards comes tumbling down. She's no longer able to sustain the unreality she yearns for, and she screams out her grief. Her cries are shevarim. Her whimpers are truah. Sisera's mom, a person whose very name has been erased by the text, who is the mother of our oppressor, the mother of a tyrant. The ancient rabbis forever tie her weeping and her moaning to our new year, to the sounds of the shofar, to our sacred cry to repent, to change, to grow. So some of you know this, some of you don't. And it's important to say that I did ask my kiddos permission before I shared this with all of you. Daniel and I have a trans child. He transitioned 2.5 years ago in what for our family is and continues to be something of a non-event. It didn't come as a surprise to those of us who knew and loved him. In fact, it was natural and beautiful. And since then, it has become clear this is exactly who he is supposed to be. And thank God we live in a bubble of love and acceptance where our family, our friends, our congregation, and his school community all not only embrace, but in fact celebrate him and the amazing human being he is becoming. And it's been easy for me to live in this bubble of beautiful acceptance and to shut out the outside world. Once we understood that our child was trans, I knew almost instinctively what I needed to do to support him as his mom. We cut off his hair, we bought him new clothes, we even changed his name. But traveling 2.5 hours to Jeff City, there and back, to sit in a room and testify, that felt like it wasn't in my lane. Almost since we got to St. Louis, Daniel has been driving down to Jeff City a few times each legislative session to represent CRC and our values and to testify against awful bills that our legislature keeps putting forward. Bills targeting trans kids, yes, but also bills that would force us to allow concealed weapons in our sanctuary. Bills that would turn IVF and IUDs and Plan B into felony murder in our state. Bills that force the justice system to treat every gun murder as self-defense unless it can be proven otherwise. But these things, they always felt so distant, so remote. The chances of them actually passing or actually impacting our lives felt impossible. And so they became something that Daniel did, that I was able to convince myself was proof that our democracy was working, and that ultimately the arc of history and of Missouri would bend towards justice. These bills will never actually pass, I told myself. Going and testifying is a Daniel thing. What if I have a panic attack? Somebody has to stay home with our children. But then this last year, I ran out of excuses. As the reality began to sink in that red states like Texas and Alabama had started sending government goons to charge parents like me with felony child abuse and to try to take away my trans kid and place him and others like him in abusive foster homes. I could no longer live in my comfortable fantasy that everything will work out. Instead, Daniel and I have found ourselves awake in the middle of the night far too many times this year, panicking about if we need to flee, whether Illinois will be far enough, wondering what happens when the same people who control our state government once again control the levers of power in our federal government. And so this year, a year when Missouri had more bills targeting trans kids than any other state, I finally went down to testify and to see for myself the reality of our state government. We were facing 18 different bills targeting trans kids and their families, the most of any state in the nation. So for me, it was high time to put on my big girl pants and make the trek to Jeff City to do what I could to protect my child and our family. Now, let me tell you a little about how all of this works. These hearings are scheduled for the most inconvenient times, in the smallest rooms, to discourage people from showing up. So I showed up my first time at 8 a.m. to a room filled with parents and kids and teachers who had each driven for hours to sit in this small, stuffy wooden box of a room for the privilege of going up to the podium to testify for 2 minutes, to try to convince our government to stop going after our kids and our families. Since Daniel had done this multiple times, on the drive there, somewhere around 5:30 in the morning, I asked him, what could he tell me about what to expect? He said, I should know that I'm going to hear some pretty awful things about our child and about me as a mother, that I should be prepared for visceral hate and cruelty to come out of the mouths of our representatives. Okay, I can handle this. Well, let me tell you, whatever I was expecting to hear our elected officials say about me as a parent or about my child, it was 10 times worse. For every supportive and loving testimony, there was someone countering with, my kid was trans because I didn't love him enough. I had to sit and listen to legislators say that my son is an abomination and that I am abusing him, that he should be taken away from our family and thrown in foster care. Sitting there in that claustrophobic basement hearing room, I forced myself to take slow, deep breaths, and I finally looked my legislators in the face. I finally accepted the reality that I had been trying to hide from for so long. It had taken me 2 long years to sit in this very spot, 2 years of justifications and excuses and rationalizations. And while it was more awful than I had imagined, more painful and more terrifying, I was so glad I had finally done it because it meant that I couldn't pretend any longer. I couldn't pretend the good was going to inevitably win. I left Jeff City, and I knew that I could never again pretend that me and my child and my family would be safe from our government here in Missouri. So I want to go back to Sisera's mom for just a moment, to this woman with no name whose whole world has just come crashing down on her, whose cries are forever woven into our Rosh Hashanah service in the form of our shofar calls. Each one of us, every day, in ways big and small, we are Sisera's mom, sitting by our windows, holding reality at bay for just a little longer. I know I am. We're Sisera's mom and how we live our consumerist lives, hoarding and exploiting resources that we know our world can't sustain. We're Sisera's mom when we bubble ourselves from the reality of democracy crumbling in Missouri, in the United States, and in Israel. We're Sisera's mom so often at work and at school when we convince ourselves that somehow the immoral things we see happening are okay. And we are Sisera's mom when we excuse the worst behaviors of our partners and our friends and ourselves. We are all Sisera's mom, and Rosh Hashanah is the day when we let the shofar's piercing blast shatter the comfortable illusions that prevent us from growing and living and changing ourselves in the world. May this year of 5783 be a year of growth for ourselves and our world. May it be a year when we as individuals and as societies face hard truths. And may this be a year of health, of happiness, and of joy for us, for our families, for our communities, and for the whole world. Shana Tova.